Hey everybody, in this video we're going to discuss what social psychology has been traditionally defined as, and a little bit about what social psychology studies, both across history and today. So, I'm going to start out by sharing my screen with you. There we go. Push that to the side here. Ooh. All right. So, first off, what is social psychology? So social psychology is the study of the effect of real or imagined others on our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. All right, just because people aren't around the real presence of others doesn't mean that they don't have an effect. In fact, even in their absence, a lot of our behaviors are driven by what we think others think of us, what we think others might think of us, and how we might want to navigate potential relationships and real relationships. And so a lot of our thinking pertains to social domains, regardless of whether people are physically around or not. So social psychology is the study of how the real or imagined presence of others affects our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. So we care about how others affect the way we think, all right, how we feel, so what emotions we might experience, and how we might behave, okay? Now, traditionally, and I'll talk more about this in a different video, social psychology has been primarily focused on, again, traditionally, social psychology was primarily focused on the effect of just social interactions, thus the social and social psychology. So how do groups affect us? But long about the time of Kurt Lewin, who is arguably one of the fathers of modern social psychology, we started incorporating this idea that the situation isn't sufficient to predict behavior. The situation can interact, it can have different effects depending upon various qualities of the person, you know. So a group approaching an extrovert and inviting them to a party might incline that person to a party, but that same situation, a group approaching a person and inviting them to a party, may elicit the exact opposite response from an introvert. And so we see the exact same situation having differing effects depending on individual differences. But again, different situations can have different effects. What if we change the situation from a group of unknown people to a group of known people, right? Now the differences in the introvert and extrovert's behaviors may not be as great. So again, starting about the time of Kurt Lewin, we start recognizing that and start thinking about as a field how the social situation interacts with what we call individual differences or subject variables. These are variables that are inherent, endogenous, intrinsic to the person, all right? And that's what, ever since Kurt Lewin, that's basically in a very broad brushstroke what we study as a field. But let's narrow in a little bit, right? So let's talk a little bit more about what we study as a field. So in general, we study, sorry, forgot to move one of my PowerPoint slides. In general, we study things like group influences, right? And so later in the class, we'll talk about a phenomenon known as diffusion of responsibility, in which the presence of others tends to cause each individual's sense of responsibility to kind of evaporate, to diffuse, right? Thus diffusion of responsibility. So we look at how groups affect individuals. Situational influences, we kind of got this all, we kind of talked a little bit about this just a little bit earlier. But I mean, how can variables within the situation change behavior? So how could the presence of a mate, a potential mate, in our situation change our behavior? You know, we might go to a party, or might, you know, maybe we're with our friends at a coffee shop or something, and we may say things, do things, you know, speak with a certain volume, with a certain animation, you know, being very kind of hand wavy like I am. We might act in a certain way when it's just our friends, but the second a attractive person walks in the room, our behaviors may change. I know, as a dork of a guy, soon as an attractive girl came in, my loud voice got really quiet, right? So a change in a situation variable changes the behavior. Social cognitive processes. The way people affect us is through what those people make us think and the way they make us feel. But one of the principal things that we have studied, at least since the 70s, is examining specifically how others change certain things in our minds, certain pieces of information. And so it's social cognitive because it very much mirrors cognitive psychology, which primarily uses something we call the information processing model. Basically, it treats the brain like a computer. All right, so you have some input, just like with a computer, right? You have a keyboard or you have a mouse, and you put some input into the computer. It processes that information and then gives me output in the form of images on the screen or sound from a speaker. The information processing model treats the mind the same way. All right, so we have input in the form of seeing different things, like a potential mate walk in the room, and then that information is processed with certain mechanisms. You can think of them like programs, software, or you know, if you want to equate them to a phone, right? Apps. Okay, so that information is processed, and then we get output, and that output generally comes in the form of you know, emotional experiences, deliberate conscious thought, overt behavior, facial expressions. And so social cognitive processes are those mechanisms, those apps, those mental apps. And so we look at how people construe information. So how do they interpret it, right? So, you know, an attractive person coming in the room may be construed as a potential mate for some folks, but not for everyone, right? So what affects the construal process? What affects a person's interpretation, right? Because a construal is an interpretation. Mental representations, right? Not everybody has the exact same mental representations. Now, people who belong to the same culture and subcultures share a lot, if not most, of their mental representations. And then as you move out of a culture, the number of mental representations that people share gets smaller. But all a mental representation is, you can think of it like a file, right? If we're going with the computer analogy, right? You can think of it like a file, okay? That's a mental representation. In the same way, you know, you might say on your flash drive or your jump drive or your thumbstick, whatever you call it, you might have a file and it has all your papers from a class, right? You have a mental representation of basketball players, okay? And so you have a mental representation of basketball players and all the qualities of a basketball player. You might have a mental representation of people like me, dorks, all right? And then you have a file, you have documents, you know, or additional information in that file, in that mental representation about dorks like me. We also study, and I alluded to this earlier, individual differences. Okay, now we're going to come back to each of these things in a little bit more depth across semester. So in general, what are some of the general areas of investigation? We've got some, probably most of what we study can be classified as studies in social interactions. Cognitive processes, those social cognitive processes I mentioned earlier. Environmental variables, all right? So not only does the social environment affect us, but sometimes non-social aspects of our non-social environment can affect us as well. Cultural contexts. Culture can sometimes have such a profound effect that it seems like we're different creatures. And we're certainly not. All humans on the planet are more alike than they are dissimilar. But differences in culture can and have provoked many a conflict, many a struggle. And biological factors, so areas that study biological factors include areas like evolutionary social psychology, social neuroscience, things like this. So let's talk about each one in a little bit more depth. So what kinds of things do we study when we're studying social interactions? Well, we study, if you think about when you meet a person, right? Even if you don't necessarily talk to that person, right? So you don't actually meet them, but your interaction with a person begins with your first perception, your first impression of them, all right? And a lot of things goes into that impression, into that first thing you perceive of that person. And once you formed that impression, it's not static. I mean, it doesn't change a whole lot, but it's not static. It can change over time. And so one of the things social psychologists study is how those initial impressions are formed, how stable those initial impressions are, what can change those initial impressions, and how those impressions can affect decisions you make about that individual, like whether you want to try and pursue a relationship, whether romantic or platonic, whether or not you want to even talk to them, whether you might instead want to avoid them, right? So one of the big things that social psychology studies is how people think about others, whether or not they've actually talked to them or know any hard information about them. We make a lot of our judgments before knowing anything more than what a person looks like, right? We also study interpersonal motives. What we want to do with another individual can guide what we perceive about that individual, can guide how we present ourselves to that individual, can guide the way we behave towards those individuals. So if we are in a mating frame of mind, so we want to find a romantic partner, right? Then that's going to change how we interpret other people's behavior towards us. So for example, men have an optimism bias such that they tend to overestimate the sexual interest of women, all right? That's shaped by that interpersonal motive that men tend to have. On average, men tend to be more mating focused than women are, or at least short-term mating focused than women are, on average. But the interpersonal motives that we have can shape, like I said, how we behave towards others, how we think about those others, how we present and how we present ourselves. Social interactions can also involve some more concrete, basic aspects like behavior coordination. When we're talking to somebody, and I don't know if this happens via video interactions, but it certainly happens in in-person interactions. We tend to, if we like them at all, we will occasionally mimic them. Okay, and what that means is we will essentially reflect their behavior back to them. So if they smile, we'll feel an inclination to at least grin back. If they're doing this, right, they're nodding their head, right, you will feel at least a little inclination to nod back, okay? This is called mimicry, all right? We're reflecting we're mimicking their behaviors back to them. We also study things like team behaviors. How do people coordinate? How are things like leadership established? So these are all things that social psychologists study when they're studying social interactions. We also study a lot of processes that can all be classified as social cognition. So we study things like attitudes. And in fact, in a way, social psychology was a little bit cognitive before cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology didn't come around until the 50s and 60s. But social psychology was studying attitudes clear back into the 30s, and maybe a little bit before, but I've only read something in the 30s. So social psychology was social cognitive-esque long before before cognitive psychology even came around. And so attitudes and attribution, but certainly attitudes, are some of the oldest ideas, concepts studied by social psychology. So we have a whole chapter over attitudes. We'll get into attribution when we talk about social cognition. We'll talk about schemata when we talk about social cognition, because schemas are actually something that comes to us from computer science. Again, cognition's based on the information processing model, and the information processing model, although I don't think I said this, was inspired by computers. Schema is a knowledge structure that we have. Now, again, it comes to us from computer science. It's basically how information was stored. And that's what it is for us. It's how we store information. And we have schemata for literally everything that we have an idea about. We have a schema for ourselves, a schema for each individual other person we know. We have a schema for each group of people we identify. You have a schema for keyboard. You have a schema for computer. We have a schema for remote. We have a schema for literally every, whoa, what happened here? Clearly I pressed something. We have a schema for literally every category we have. And in fact, that's one of the fundamental aspects of how we think. We think categorically. We form categories based on information we've encountered, and then organize that information into categories. Now, we then abstract from those categories certain generalizable information that we then use as a kind of template for thinking about everybody. We use it to do a number of things, okay? And we'll learn more about the schemata in the social cognition chapter. But studying how these schemata are used is a big part of social cognitive research. Automaticity. Also in the social cognition chapter, we'll learn about something that these authors refer to as the duplex theory of mind. That's traditionally not what it's been referred to. Rather, it's been referred to as automaticity. So the study of automatic thinking and behavior. All right, that's automaticity. But the study has gone by a lot, or this research, this area of research has gone by a lot of names over the years. Automaticity has been the most common. Study of dual processing has been another common one. But we'll see that, and a good deal of that research, again, in the social cognition chapter. There's the slide I apparently accidentally created. Environmental variables. Yes, like I said, even aspects of our environment that are not social can affect us, like the weather. For example, Clore, in one of his very classic studies, found that people reported being happier when they were asked to report their mood on sunny days than compared to those who were asked to report their mood on cloudy days. All right. Now, interestingly enough, that difference was only there when they hadn't already been asked what the weather was like. So they called up people on their phones, back when people had landline phones, all right, asked them, to report how well, report their happiness, and then ask them to report the weather for the day, right? Other people got the exact opposite order. So other people, when they answered the phone, they were asked what the weather is like, and then uh, to report their happiness. So when people's attention had been brought to the weather, it had no effect on the mood. But when people weren't aware of and weren't thinking about how the weather might affect their mood, it did. So you see, this unattended to thing, the weather, affected something that they thought about themselves, their own mood. And so I think it's kind of cool, but this is an example of how how things that we're not even aware of can affect us. All right. And that's honestly one of my favorite things about social psych and psychology in general, but especially social psych, because in social psych, we tend to care about the behaviors that people encounter every day, right? We care about mating, we care about, decision making, we care about people's evaluations of each other. These tend to be the questions that we think about, right? What makes, people hate each other? That's very often a social psych question. What makes people adopt certain attitudes and then stick to them and ignore anything that contradicts that idea? Again, that's something we address in social psych. So a lot of the questions people ask about other people are social psych questions. And one of the cool things that I've discovered, because my PhD is in experimental psychology, and the area that I was primarily trained in, because we had to pick a specialty in our program, was social psych. So social psych, I picked because I had already fallen in love with it before I went off to my PhD program. That's why I applied to that program, so I could get that expertise. And I fell in love with it for reasons like this. Things that we don't even pay attention to, that we're not even aware that are affecting us, affect us. All right, and that's one of the coolest things to me. All right, and it's not just the weather that can affect us without us even being aware of it. Things like temperature, and I don't mean the weather temperature. I mean, in fact, that's what this picture is here's for. Things like the room temperature, or that picture is there because in one study by Barge and colleagues, they had participants, an experimenter take the participant, and the experimenter always had coffee. Now, they manipulated whether the coffee was hot, cold, and then they asked the participant to hold whatever it was that they were drinking. And while the researcher went and did something, I forget exactly what it was that they were doing. But that meant that some of the participants held a cold cup of coffee, and other participants held a hot cup of coffee. And I should say, not just a cold cup of coffee, because that's disgusting, but iced coffee. All right. If you like cold black coffee, I don't know what's wrong with you. I'm playing. So what they then had the participants complete the study, and in the study, they asked them to provide their evaluation of the research. And what they found is that when participants held the iced coffee, they had more negative impressions of the researcher than did those who held the warm coffee. Why? Well, again, more than likely, the participants weren't even aware of it. All right. Instead, holding the warm cup of coffee activated the concept of warmth. Now think about it. When we describe people as warm, we tend to evaluate them positively. When they held the iced coffee, it activated the concept of cold. And again, when we think about people being cold, we tend to think of them negatively. All right. And so even though participants weren't even aware that the temperature of the cup of coffee had any influence on the way they were thinking, Barge and colleagues found that it did. All right. Things like environmental uncertainty. Sometimes the environment is dangerous. Right? Sometimes it's uncertain. Sometimes you don't know what's going to happen. Well, work by Griscovicius and some colleagues have found that people act very differently when they think their environment is uncertain, when they think that there's a greater chance of, of them being hurt. All right. Sex distributions. In one really cool, I'm a dork, so it's really cool to me. In one really cool study, Kenrick and colleagues found that when you compare the credit card debt of two cities, the sex distribution affected the average credit card debt, such that when there were more men than women, credit card debt was much higher than when there were more women than men. All right. Now, why? Why is that? Well, I'm going to leave that. Hopefully, that'll be a nugget in the back of your head that'll interest you, and we'll bring it up later. But just for now, remember that it has to do with the distribution of sex ratios. All right. Now, we also study, of course, cultural context. As I mentioned before, sometimes cultural differences can be so vast that it seems like we're from different planets, right? And so we study the various ways culture can affect us. We study how culture can affect emotion and emotion recognition, all right? For example, one of the big differences between various types of cultures is whether they think of the group as in a very groupish way, as being a coherent whole, or if they think of the group as just a random collection of individuals, right? So if they think of the group in a groupish way, they think of it as a coherent whole, then they have more of a collectivistic construal of their group. If they think of their group as a collection of individuals, then they have more of an individualistic construal. Well, what we know is that when somebody who has more of when a person has more of a collectivistic construal and they look at a person and they see the emotional expression on that person's face, they don't judge that person's emotion state based solely on that person's face. They will also consider the emotional expressions of other people they think belong to their group. All right. Whereas in people with more of an individualistic construal, they basically isolate a single person away from their group. All right. So the way the way a culture leads a person to think collectivistically, individualistically, can change emotional expression. It can change the way they think. So remember, I mentioned if you think about the group as a coherent whole, right? That's more holistic thinking. People who have more holistic thinking, they tend to be more okay with gray area, right? They tend to, you might have heard of the idea of yin and yang, right? The idea that good and evil must coexist, right? So that's a definite gray area. People who are in more individualistic cultures and societies, they tend to think more dichotomously. Something must be right or wrong. Something has to be correct or incorrect. And so that's very dichotomous. It's either or. It cannot be both. All right. So people from more individualistic cultures tend to think more dichotomously and therefore have more trouble with gray areas. Whereas people who are from more collectivistic cultures, they think more holistically and they have less of a problem and are more expecting of gray areas. People in collectivistic cultures and individualistic cultures differ in how they construe themselves, right? So a person from a collectivistic culture is more likely to think of themselves, more likely to interpret themselves as being one of a whole, not an individual entity really, so much as one of a whole, one member of an integrated group. But a person from an individualistic society, they're going to construe themselves instead as a individual autonomous agent. Now that can have various, those differences can have various effects. So for example, if I'm from a collectivistic culture and I have what we call an interdependent self-construal, I view myself as a part of a group, then I'm going to expect, I'm going to assume, I'm going to believe that my emotions and my decisions, my success, my achievements, my failures, don't just affect me and are not just a product of my actions and efforts. I'm going to assume that my successes, failures, actions, thoughts are actually a product of the whole group. But if instead I come from an individualistic society, then I'm going to assume that my achievements, my failures, my thoughts, my emotions are a product of my own considerations, my own thinking, my own efforts. So if we look at something like how influenced we are by others, somebody from a collectivistic culture who has an interdependent self-control may think, yeah, of course I'm affected by others. I wouldn't be a good member of the group if I wasn't. A person with what we call an independent self-control from an individualistic society, these individuals are more prone to think, well, yeah, other people can influence me, but only when I want them to, only when I let them. All right. So it may seem like a subtle distinction, but it can have a number of consequences, which we'll see as we go through the class. And then finally, we study biological factors. So again, like there's a whole subfield of social psychology just devoted to studying these biological factors, known as social neuroscience, and to some extent, evolutionary social psych. But these biological factors can include things like hormones and neurotransmitters. All right, so hormones like testosterone, right? Testosterone has a loose association with aggression. It also has a loose association, even though I forgot to list it there, has a loose association with sex drive. All right. Now I say loose because it's not, if your testosterone goes up, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to punch somebody or be more aggressive or cuss somebody out. But there is a loose association there. All right. Also, we look at how different parts of the brain are involved in different social processes that we might care about. So, for example, the ACC, or that stands for anterior, ANTERIOR, anterior cingulate, CINGULATE, cingulate cortex. All right, the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex is at the front, anterior, of a kind of C-shaped structure on the inside of your brain. You can see it, it's in yellow here. All right. This part of the cingulate cortex, this anterior part of it, is heavily involved in distress. All right. Specifically, the distress that we feel when we're hurt. Okay. And so that hurt is not only the hurt that we feel when we're physically hurt. Somebody punches you and you feel the pain, or you stub your toe, all right? That's physical pain. And the anterior cingulate cortex is that part that makes you or that, all right? Because those are expressions of distress. But it also is involved in your processing of social distress. So when you lose someone, when someone breaks up with you, when someone rejects you, all right? These are forms of social distress. And the anterior cingulate cortex, the same part of your brain that processes the distress involved in stubbing your toe, the same part of the brain that's involved in that is involved in your reaction to being broken up with. All right, and social neuroscience, and to some extent the rest of social psychology studies things like that. And that, my friends, concludes this video over what is social psychology and what does it study. Okay, so in this video we defined it, all right, and it's a traditional definition, and you won't find that definition in every single textbook, but it'll always be some version of it. it'll always be in the definition of social psychology in every social psychology textbook will be some version of that. We talked a little bit about what we studied historically and a little bit about what we studied today. Okay. All right, guys, that's this video. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. If not, I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you later on.